Thank you. Okay. All right, all set, Dennis. Thank you.
Is that readable, or have I screwed up again in terms of the size?
It's slow for me. It still says starting to share.
Ah,
What? I can read that.
It looks good once it popped up to me.
Go.
so the intent of these slides is to actually just put a bow around sort of the suggestion that was the consequence of the early analysis we did. That is that there probably ought to be a separate track aimed at EDR extensions for the more comprehensive detection and response use cases, things that don't fit, in my view, sort of a direct extension of OpenC2, or at least with the kinds of parameters we have. Let me explain what that means. So to solicit feedback, I've got a few questions in here. The suggestion for the second track is driven by the problem, I think, that exists in the mismatch between NDR, EDR, XDR, MDR, all of the Gartner names for detection and response that essentially anchors in TTPs and recognizes attacks, but allows mitigations to some of that footprint. This doesn't address what we originally had talked to about ADR, which is sort of the more simplistic stuff, the stuff that says I have a clear indicator, a clear mitigation point at which I might do a clear block of something simple. That isn't what EDR and NDR, XDR, or MDR are about. That is sort of the simplest use of these kinds of technologies. But it's when you start looking at the different products and have the ambition of trying to normalize how you interact with them in the same enterprise, that is different products in the same enterprise, that it becomes clear that the detection and response products detect exactly the same attack behaviors in general, but using very, very different indicators or TTPs to get there. The way you see that is by looking at the evaluation in MITRE of different products for exactly the same attack scenarios. In that domain, you see very different footprint of what was detected, yet they may reach the same conclusion that they saw the same attack. Because of that, you can't really interact with them at the TTP layer in terms of getting that from the agent telemetry and using it to inform response or to synchronize or coordinate the behavior across different products in the same enterprise. The second challenge is that they expose the detection at different places. If you got a detection and response product that has a cloud backend machine learning sort of detection mechanism, Carbon Black, for instance, has that, then you don't see the detection until after it shows up either in the cloud detection or in a trained inference engine that's gotten shoved down to the agent endpoint and is doing its stuff there. But the only explanation, the only actionability you get is by interacting with the controller that is aware of the particular machine learning algorithm, the particular training sets. There's lots and lots of variation, and those in no way are comparable across different EDR technologies. The third challenge that gets thrown at us is they consume response at different places. It's not until I get to that detection of what the attack was that I can decide rationally what my response ought to be. And that's a challenge because different of the products assert response options at different places and in different kinds of things. So you can't say block at all of the products and have it happen at the agents, happen at the controller, happen in whatever the provisioning system that has been integrated, and expect a coherent response across those. But all of those detection and response products now are, especially the ones that are showing up in the evaluations and feel they need to compete in the market, are mapping their detections, for instance, to the attack matrix. What happens there is very different TTP detections are now mapped into a place where they're all talking the same language again, the particular attack, regardless of what subset of the TTP footprint that they detected. That's very interesting in that it presents a very opportune normalization boundary for us. We can talk across products about what they detected, not how they detected it in a consistent way. Also, you get a really interesting beginning to map to a more consistent set of identifiers as you step back and talk to the controller, because they wind up recognizing that they have to connect the dots between, for instance, the containers, the operating system instance, the virtualized or physical asset on which those are running. Those are all very different identifiers and may be dynamic across the normal life cycle of the operation of those things. So that's sort of the scope of the problem, if you will, that I think stimulates the need to look further at what we normalize in order to get at this broader, how do we fully leverage EDR, NDR, XDR, MDR across products in the same enterprise kind of environment. And there's some, I think, low-hanging fruit in terms of things we can normalize and use as interaction. Given that's the problem, any big questions about the problem before I talk about what I think this track could do as opportune sorts of steps, but we got to agree to some extent on what the problem is and whether or not that's a real problem for the group. So let me open the question to that. Let me go back to that and say, all right, any problems with this specification or this description of the problem? I think the second track would aim.
No issues for me.
Right, hold that for now. If there's more, we can certainly talk about them a little bit later. So the first order normalizations I think we could go at are that interacting with detection and response products can be normalized. We can say for one product, you ought to talk to the controller. For another product, you ought to be able to talk to the agent telemetry. And for yet another, if there's another in-between place, maybe those mid-tier concentrators, that might be an appropriate place to talk to them. In any of those cases, if we had that as essentially a way to represent that for different products, then what would happen is our ability to aim a command and control kind of infrastructure at it could do the right thing for the right product, allowing us to essentially have multiple different products in the same enterprise, but with a coordinated kind of action. But you need to be able to pivot on what do you talk to in a particular product. It depends on where they expose the APIs for interacting with their systems. I think the second is the identifiers. Many of the products are still anchored to things like IP addresses or MAC addresses, or if they're an endpoint product, the system SID, something that is a reliable identifier for their perspective. None of that works really well for the modernized workloads that are both more distributed, more dynamic, and more decoupled from the stacks on which they run. And they are the thing that's working in the Amazon cloud, for instance, and in all of the public cloud platforms, are the GUIDs. Because a set of GUIDs can always be mapped to or resolved to what's the current IP address for that thing, what is the current VPC in which it's operating. You get a way to get the life cycle of either the application or the thing that was used to provision it or the testing associated with it. You get a way to connect the dots. You don't have that if all you use is IP addresses and MAC addresses and system SIDs, and you're trying to connect across network detection and response and endpoint detection and response and the underlying dynamics of the things that you're monitoring and protecting, much less the mitigations that you might put in place. On AWS, ARNs, the Amazon resource numbers, handily solve this problem and can always be resolved to those other proxies that we can then connect the dots to the rest of the infrastructure. The suggestion then might be normalized to a set of unique identifiers, which we then, whatever the right ones for the platform we're dealing with are, and then consider whether we want to normalize for other platforms, the rest of the on-prem or private or public cloud domains, and then separately figure out how to normalize across platforms. The interesting thing there is there's some work on things like global network identifiers and global namespaces. NSF funded a ton of that at University of Maryland, I believe at Amherst, and it turned into an interesting sort of standard. And a bunch of the commercial folks who are looking at how do I refer to an asset when it's on another platform have looked at how do I bring multiple GUID sort of schemes together. so that I can represent one and be unambiguous about what am I talking about in a broad sense. And of course, that's something indigenous to, for instance, Google's cross-cloud solution in an interesting way. And of course, VMware's has one as well. I think we call ours global network identifiers, and I'm not sure what it is in the Anthos domain, but it's something like that. So having the anchor that lets you talk about what is the thing I was detecting a behavior on, and where am I putting the mitigations, and how are those related topologically? Those are all things you can answer if you use GUIDs. If you anchor on IPs or MACs or system SIDs, they wind up breaking in some part of the ecosystem and probably breaking over time in a fundamental way. There's a couple of other places that are normalization opportunities. The detections, it's very interesting that MITRE demonstrated that that's effective in comparing alternative solutions. So attack's a possibility. An enhanced version of TAC probably is appropriate for our interest in making the ontology really clean, but there may be other options as well. And so that is a question I think we ought to ask and answer within the track. And then separately, the response. How do we connect either the mitigations that are associated with each of the TTPs in something like the attack framework, or with a more complete look at maybe the defend framework, where there's not a one-to-one association with a TTP and what you do to respond to a detected attack, but in fact, maybe something more systemic and maybe more flexible. Because it's always possible you want to sandbox this thing and continue to observe it. You may want to re-provision from scratch after sort of freeze drawing the forensics so that you can look at them later, the Google rapid response kind of approach. There's lots of options there. I think that these are low-hanging fruits, things we could propose to do about the problem we raised in the first slide. That might be the meat of what I think I'm suggesting about the second parallel track, intended wholly not to slow down whatever we do going after the original efforts and activities in the group. What do these sound like in terms of potential steps in the right direction that might be the effort in the second track? Is anything implausible or just completely wrong as far as you're concerned in this domain?
Well, I have to admit, I'm a little bit lost here because I'm trying to picture this, and one of the things that I'm having trouble wrapping my head around is what's going to map all these UIDs together, especially in cases where you have associations. I mean, you mentioned a couple of these cases here where, but I'm just thinking when you're talking about something about Amazon or even on-prem or something, I'm going to have users, I'm going to have, individual system machines, right? And maybe, MAC addresses, IP addresses, all of these things that are going to represent different UIDs. What is combining these into a logical entity? For cases where these may all map to what's essentially the same thing.
So I'm not proposing in this that we do all the work of the runtime mapping of that. What I'm suggesting, I guess, is that in order to solve the original problem, which was show me something I've detected with potentially a combination of EDR, NDR, XDR tools in an enterprise environment, how do I say something about the thing I've detected and do something about it across products? So I think all we need to do is to give to that, let's call it unified detection and response layer, to give to that identifiers that can be reconciled. So I can say, I have an identifier on this Kubernetes hosted service mesh for an asset that's behaving badly. I see something about it and I can refer to it regardless, unambiguously, regardless of what happens to it. That just means that instead of giving that unified command and control layer, instead of giving it an IP address, which would break if there's any dynamics or any ambiguity or any number of things, I give it that normalized definition, the GUID, which has the right reference for whatever the hosting platform is, if that makes sense. So the idea was just to bridge the gap, the thing that's broken when you try to deal with detection and response, and you're talking about, in modernized case, assets that are more dynamic. In the different tools case, assets that use different either abstractions or different identifiers. And so this just gives us a place at which to close that gap. It doesn't answer the question, how do the underlying mechanisms actually do that? In Amazon, that is a solved problem for you. You give it a GUID, and it will bind to the right asset in your namespace, and you don't have to do any translation beyond that. It's perfectly fine to refer to a VPC or a workload or the thing that provisioned the workload by its GUID, as long as you gave it that in detection and as long as you give it that in what you do as a mitigation. So as long as you're dealing with the particular platform, you don't have to do the work. If you try to step back, though, and maybe this is what you were suggesting, and look at on-premise assets and on-cloud assets across multiple different clouds, and you try to make sense of one kind of GUID here, one kind of GUID there, and IP addresses over here, those don't unify. But what they can get unified at is if I use, for instance, the same container GUID for a workload that might have gone across all of those environments, then I do get back that invariance, that unambiguous reference to, I know what that application is and what was used to provision it, even if what might be changing is the underlying hosting environment, because I've load balanced or I've failed over or I've bursted to the cloud or something like that, if that makes sense. So the only point here is to let ourselves use identifiers that can address the dynamics, the distribution, and the decoupling, even the variation across the products, by just saying we've got a more complex but a more complete identifier that can tolerate all those dynamics. It doesn't answer the question, how will Amazon turn that into the specific asset that's out there, although that mechanism exists in all of the platforms. Does that make sense? Or?
I think.
Yeah, it does. I think what I was missing was the namespace aspect of this, where this GUID is representative only for a specific vendor platform. But it does mean somebody has to take, if I've deployed my Palo Alto firewall in an AWS VPC and it's doing stuff, it doesn't even realize it's in Amazon, so it doesn't know what an ARN is. And sooner or later, all this stuff has got to go back to somebody has to map those.
Yeah, now,
eventually.
You got your finger on the pulse of a problem there. The individual NDR, EDR, NDR, whatever products, the star DR product, those guys are going to have to wrap their heads around this as well for exactly the problem that you're suggesting. If they could insist on looking at the world from a locally resolvable IP address point of view, when they bring this stuff back to a data lake, they can't see across the relationship between the assets. They won't see the topological relationships, they won't see the end-to-end relationships, and they won't be able to connect to things like, what do I know about this thing that happened during development, like its testedness or observed behaviors or curation, think Log4j. You won't be able to connect across the life cycles. And, frankly, we've been effective to some extent by doing that. It's just things are sort of changing, and we may want to be able to get that broader, more comprehensive scope. We certainly do want to apply to the more modernized application technologies that we're incentivizing intensely, especially as a consequence of things like the EO. But that's not work we can do as a standards organization. That is something that the individual participants in the ecosystem, the solution vendors, producers, developers, they probably should begin to wrap their heads around to be applicable to cloud environments and to microservices and to service meshes and that sort of thing, if that makes sense.
Hey, this is Forrest, and sorry I came in late, but first of all, can you guys hear me?
Oh, yeah.
So I think there's a little different answer to the question about how this map, and I think Dennis kind of hit on it before the question was asked, is I think if I understand correctly, is that what maps it together is the ontology which identifies that there's actually a physical thing of which we often represent with the logical network address being the IP address, or the logical physical address being the MAC address. Those are both representatives of some actual thing, which is the thing that we're actually worried about having malware on it or need to be protected or whatever. And then the problem is that that physical thing, even if we identify it is, there's actually computer number one, it has to be given itself a GUID so that we can all make sure that once I've identified this physical thing, we are all talking about the same physical thing. So it's kind of a two-part problem. One, identifying what the IP and MAC address are really talking about. And two is making sure that once we've identified it, we've identified it uniquely so that we can all be organizing our information around the proper thing. Is that sync with what you're saying, Dennis?
Yeah, it's sort of in the meat of the problem where we're dealing with a microcosm of the upper and lower ontology problem. We need equivalence, and we need sort of that underlying what is the thing in the context in which we're considering detection and mitigation. And looking across them, you got to connect the dots between some isomorphisms, like the boundaries and the assets themselves. When I look across Azure and I look across Amazon and AWS and of course any of the other platforms, there are isomorphisms and you can connect the dots. They're just not called the same things and may not use the same identifier. So to my mind, your explanation gets into the heart of it. But that is exactly the kind of discussion I think that and exploration that ought happen inside the second track, if that makes sense.
But we need to identify the immutable thing versus the ephemeral things, like the scale set in Azure or whatever. It needs to be that thing that we can control that may have many different forms, IP addresses, all these ephemeral characteristics to it. How do we identify the thing that we need to touch specifically? And just to follow on to that, there's a issue of I can block an IP address immediately, but actually going and patching an operational production system for logic, there's stages of mitigation. So blocking the current ephemeral IP would be an immediately effective thing, but then I need to also through this life cycle manage and get to the root cause protections. So the mapping of these GUIDs across that. And then also, not to throw more complexity, different technologies have different levels of effectiveness to mitigation. And I might have in my environment one that is more effective than A, B, or C that are also in my environment. And I would want to direct these things to that mitigation control point.
So you're getting hip deep into what I hope we enable making forward progress on. I'm certainly not bringing all of that into the scope of this group, but
I'm going down the route to demonstrate at the abstraction layer the complexities that when we take this concept and apply it, that you got all these. So anyway, I'm not sure what the answer is. I just good conversation though.
But pulling on that thread, bringing the abstractions into visibility is exactly what you want to do. So you've got the right instinct. It's got to be, we got to know where those isolation boundaries are and what the topological relationships are, whatever the identifiers are. And so it's the construction of that model in your head of where's the right place to do what, that we enable actionable response with.
And where my effective mitigation points are, control points are.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry, guys, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Russ. There's a couple of things I observed also. I love your GUID approach. I think that does kind of span the technologies. I mean, I see some other related things we can do with GUIDs. I can think of a community of GUIDs, of those things that have discovered this malware or seen it and sniffed out some level of security information about it, i.e., gives us the ability to address the community of things that are interested in this particular problem, a la the malware. It'd be nice to have almost a directory of those. So back to your point that you were making, Patrick. So now I know everybody that's interested or has detected this or can help us deal with this. We know who they are because these GUIDs can identify them for us, so we can address them. And the other thing I think it's interesting on the GUIDs that we may want to do as an adjacent is the security of them, to make sure whoever the GUID is really who they think they are, they say they are. And that almost gets back to zero trust a little bit, but there's let's make sure that the GUIDs that we are relying on for secure information are who they think they are, right? So those are kind of adjacents that I think could, once we use that principle, we can, work something around those two things to give us a community of interested parties, if you will. And then the other one is to secure the community that's conversing about the security and defensing together, and we're all on the same side.
And we could come up with a deterministic GUID. Use deterministic GUIDs within a given community of trust to where you could use UUID version 5, etc. So you would have the ability to go back and test aspects of that GUID to do that, source traceability, etc. I don't know if that's too obscure, but yeah, there's an easy way to accomplish that within a given. I wouldn't want to try to come up with an international standard on that. It would never work, but you could, within a given community of trust, share what my organizational IDs are and some keyword or whatever. So you could construct recoverable GUIDs that you could recover and test. But I'm going down the weeds again. I'm sorry. It's one of my bad habits.
So I don't think we have to invent all this stuff. I do know that, for instance, Google and Google Rapid Response sort of explored these things with respect to cloud forensics and what they needed to do differently and at their kind of scale. Amazon certainly has an awful lot of connecting the dots right now between the development lifecycle and what happens at runtime and how that can be made sense of for supply chain, as well as for reference models for things like zero trust and policy and that sort of thing. Those may be coming our way, and that they give us abstractions that are intentionally designed to give you some handles on how to reason about this stuff and how they're related. So sort of interrogating those, getting them to be partners in this exploration could be a really useful thing. Certainly Red Hat's all over this as well. So I think there's real possibilities there. But we wouldn't pursue all these at once. We probably ought to pick an ordering. So if these sound viable to you, think about what the prioritization ought to be. But I'll hop to the next slide, which is, I think, a next step could be interesting because I've invoked MITRE in vain a couple of times here. I've got a meeting with their strategy folks on Friday to see if they're open to setting a meeting with us to talk about what they anticipate the role of, for instance, attack and defend in this domain, and maybe more broadly, the security automation framework. They're working heavily on some of that stuff. Getting their insight into where they're headed, what they've already decided, might tell us the degree of viability and maybe some level of potentially working with them to leverage some of that stuff might be interesting. It certainly does represent a critical mass of collected sort of insights and patterns that we might be able to leverage if we can figure the way forward there. So that could be a next step. If we think that's true, then I'll bring that up on Friday to get their willingness to have such a meeting and have a report to you guys in email after Friday, maybe by the next Monday, as to whether they're open to talking about this. Separately, it's certainly possible to talk to EDR and NDR vendors about what they're going to do.
Hey, Dennis,
more viable.
Sorry. Back to the meeting with, when you say Friday, do you mean tomorrow, Friday?
Yeah, but that meeting is just to set up, where are they open to setting up a meeting with us to talk about this issue?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I've had those meetings with MITRE attack
awesome.
and defend guys a couple of occasions, and so, I've got a pretty good, open relationship with the MITRE attack guys, but when I try to say, look, can we have like a MITRE-wide meeting, he seems to be less optimistic that he could figure out who the right people are. So I think that's great that you're meeting with them. I wish you better luck than I had. Unfortunately, I'm going to be busy tomorrow. Otherwise, I would try to invite myself. So good luck. I'm glad you're hopefully you're more productive than I am, and I look forward to the meeting if they say yes.
Yeah, and maybe we're pushing it from two different perspectives. I'm not going attack centric. I'm actually coming from the top down, talking to the secure automation framework folks. So maybe we're talking to two different folks, and maybe we can connect the dots between them.
Well, I was trying to talk with anybody who was doing, developing any type of formal knowledge models, and then the ontology work that would be related to it. So that was my perspective. But if you take it a little different angle, that might be more productive. So that's cool.
Yeah, if anybody cares, I'm going to go at it from the FFRDC angle. That is, they always have a mandate to show to Congress their investment of tax dollars turns into public good somehow. And so getting more use of what they develop, more than they have right now, could be very, very interesting. But it remains, they've got to be open to it. And so I'll try to push. And then, of course, talking to the EDR tools and/or capability development folks, it doesn't have to be commercial guys, about what they're planning to do about being more relevant to modernize payloads, where the dynamics, the distribution, all of the decoupling in the stack become a challenge for them, even in their own analytics frameworks within their own products. If we could get a feel for what they're going to do, what they think is viable, what they be amenable to, we might have less of a gap to close, but we can only know by asking the question. The one thing I can guarantee here is we could probably get Carbon Black and Last Line in a conversation because they're in my company and I've got a way to twist arms there. I'm not sure the degree to which we can get engagement with the other folks, but I gotta believe both CrowdStrike and FireEye are interested in this domain, and probably others, but those are proposed. Now, the big picture question is, given all of that, if that doesn't make you throw up, and I'm not dead wrong about this stuff, is this the right time for us to sink our teeth into this? I think it is because of, for instance, the EO mandate about getting EDR onto all, and I think they mean any kind of detection and response, but EDR onto all federal systems. That raises this question: how do they reason across them to give visibility into CISA and other folks that are going to be looking at this? Secondly, the modernization mandate inside of the EO says you're going to bias your budget toward more cloud-friendly technologies and things that have the problem that we're talking about in the earlier slides. And so while this all won't happen at once, it seems to put these problems and the potential solutions we've talked about into the light that it's more likely we're going to need answers to these questions. And I think we can be contributory in helping to do something about that. But this is a fair bit of work. It is different. It isn't immediately going to turn into wins. It's going to turn into analysis and understanding and standardization, and then eventually turns into product capability that's leverageable in the market, or demonstrations we do, and maybe tools. So the question is for us as a group, is this where we want to put our time? We don't have to address every good problem or every every important problem or every promising opportunity. There are more of those than there are resources. And the question is this the right one? We do have the first track, the one that Russ has been shepherding on what can we do with what we have now, and as far as we can push things like OpenC2 and OS Query and those sorts of things. There's utility there. My only concern is that it's not all of the utility associated with XDR. It's not, in fact, the utility that motivates us to want to use XDR, which tended to be emergent threat and things with TTPs and things for which mitigations might be a point in the attack lifecycle. And those just were things I want to make some headway on. So I think that's all the stuff I wanted to take up. I think the biggest picture question is, do we want to have that second track? And separately, for your consideration, maybe after the meeting, are those the right kinds of problem and or areas to dig into? It sounded like we didn't have revulsion, but frankly, you should have the opportunity to think about this and to do considered response to it. So that's all I had to say. Russ, sort of over to you.
Yeah, no problem. So a couple comments on what you said. On your previous chart, just there's some sensitivity at the PGB level when we start talking about, hey, we're going to other groups without their knowledge kind of thing. So I think that not that chart, the next one, the one with the Oasis thing that you said there. If you could make that, change that chart to say, set up a discussion with the OCA, right, architecture work group.
Oh,
Right?
I'm sorry. Absolute.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I can see Duncan having a heart attack and shooting things at me. So, um,
So I should say
OCA, yeah, the OCA, architecture work group, yeah, and we're just having discussions, right? Just because I don't want people to take that out of context.
Yeah, completely exploratory, not contractual.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that put that in there and then send me the chart back so people don't read it and go, oh my God, these guys are crazy over in that work group. What the heck are they doing?
Got it.
And the thing I like about this, and it's a good comment to your second chart, is I kind of like. I like the aligning with the MITRE defense and attack systems. I think those have been successful. I think that it's a good model. I think it fits nicely with what we're doing. And I almost think that we can add the value of the MITRE attack and defend is a great structure to map to, but it doesn't really deal with the interoperation integration of a bunch of coordinated resources that understand MITRE attack, friends, detected. And that's where I think we can help. So part of me thinks that'd be our focus. And so if that's true, if you agree with that, then the proposal of going to other things to me is diffusing the focus and the resources we have on things that are interesting, but I won't make any progress on the first one if I'm spending time on all these other things. So I'm worried more about scope rather than I agree both of those topics are awesome, but I would love to kind of dig in with the MITRE guys, starting with this work group you're kicking off, to discuss, how do we help with the collaborative integration or operation of what we're trying to do with our architectures and, with OpenC2 for, common commands controls and what they're trying to do, which is model and map the consistency across the unique space of things that do these things. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so I think an important thing is to decide how do we prioritize among these things, as you suggest, the first rather than the second, and then a ranking of which of these do we attack first and with what kind of scope on them, because they all are open-ended. If we decided to extend this to multiple platforms, there would be no end, or all platforms, there would be no end. So I think you're right. And so we want to apply the same exercise. How do we prioritize / triage this list as well? But go ahead.
No, I agree with this. I mean, for this list, I just love the GUID whole conversation. So, I mean, I would try and think about how that concept can help us, bring together the abstraction of resources that are, not consistent and enable us to address, right, taking actions and querying across very diverse environments as well as diverse solutions. I just kind of like that whole approach where GUID gives me that handle, if you will. To me, anyway, that's my input. Anybody else on the group, please, what do you think is most important out of this? I think that was the most interesting.
I think engaging in the dialogue would be productive, at least taking it that far.
I think it is important, and especially when you're trying to integrate disparate data sources that from different people at different environments, and they set up their own IDs in their databases, usually out of necessity, but they're only local IDs. That allows us to get a bit more enterprise and cross-platform flexibility in our solutioning, I think. Over.
And this work, Dennis, and I think Forrest, you mentioned it, is a really nice map into the work that we're doing, that Forrest team's doing on the ontology. So, I think the discussion of, as we resolve the GUIDs into the things, the physical things, as Forrest called them, we can make sure the ontology kind of helps us with that. So we've got a nice model that fits together.
Yeah, it lets you connect context that might surface at different levels of abstraction. And so I think you're right. Reasoning about this stuff requires the semantic sort of structure to be coherent. Anyhow, I think next order of business is to chew on this and to get sort of your considered feedback on it, and then decide what parts you want to sink your teeth into once we do the triage, the prioritization, maybe next meeting. Is that a good objective for us?
Yeah, sounds great to me. I can't come up with anything better, that's for sure. Yeah. Anybody else?
Sounds good to me.
Ready.
Super. Again, thanks so much, Dennis, for leading us through all this conversation. It's been extremely helpful to.
Well, I'm standing squarely on previous conversations in this group and in other places, so I'm just coordinating.
Okay, appreciate that. And again, to follow up, I will change the meetings times based on the input you guys gave me, so we can get Vasilius in these discussions, because that'll be exciting, getting him involved with this as well. And so I'll try and find a time that, based on the chat information I got, that's the most consistent with those. Do you guys want me to send out a doodle poll to each of you as well, just to make sure I've got the right input from you, or are you guys okay with what the chat you give me in the chat?
Honestly, I think that the doodle poll would probably be redundant for the people who are here, but if there are other people who'd like to participate and possibly can't because of timing now, I'm sure there are probably others that would like to do that are probably on email, but not here in this group.
You're right, Andrew. Okay, all right. So I'll do a doodle poll anyway. I'll copy you guys on it. You don't have to respond if you've given me your chat input, and then I'll reschedule the calls for a different time. It'll be 2 weeks from now, but it'll maybe a different time. Definitely be a different time, maybe a different day, based on the poll. Okay.
Already.
All right. Thanks everybody again. Thank you, Dennis, for this discussion.
Thanks, guys.